Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast in which Craig Touch, myself, Roland Hume, chat some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and publishing. And today we are delighted to welcome a very special guest with an absolutely fascinating story. He writes as Charles E. Wallace Jr., but we will call you Chip if that's okay. How are you doing today, Chip?
Pretty good.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We can't wait to hear all of the details of this book that you've written. But first of all, we have to introduce the other man who we wouldn't be here without, Mr. Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing great. Thanks, Roland, and thanks for joining us, Chip. So as Roland said, you have an interesting story that you turned into a book. You're not, I'm not going to say you're not an author because you've written a book, but that wasn't sort of like the goal, wasn't to write a book. It was sort of like the story happened. You needed to, well, we'll get into that, but basically it became a book, and then now you found yourself sort of straddling two different genres that it could really fit into, and not, you and I were talking before we started. It's not like that, dual genre that some authors straddle where they go well together. It's like, oh, it's my romantic fantasy, and yeah, okay, you can sell it as romantic fantasy. That's like a subgenre, right? You've got like, true crime versus, self-help or not even self-help, but like, warning thing to that people might be looking up for helping their parents or whatever. But anyways, let's get into the story first and what happened briefly, and then we'll go from there and make more sense to everybody.
Sure. So basically, as I mentioned, I started as my background is technology and finance, and my mother passed away in 22. And as we started approaching the probate process, I wanted to try to document all that was going on, because I noticed things had been going on that weren't quite right. And the more I wrote, I realized I had quite a lot of content. And so I decided after about a year or so to put it into a book. And it describes basically what my mother went through, as she basically had dementia going from 2018 into 22, and what experiences she had unbeknownst to us, because we were not around. She was a good 700 miles away from me. And so we documented that experience, what occurred with the caregiver and her financing, basically stealing of funds and property, as well as the kind of the mysterious disappearance of the caregiver after about 3 months after my mother passed. In what we would call suspicious circumstances. But the net result is I've got a book that basically says, hey, I've got something that's for caregivers, people that are looking for caregivers, something on the other end of true crime. Did this person really disappear? And even something for, legal and academics, that people that are, researching elder care, long-term care facilities, things that to look out for as far as how do you interview and how do you look for a caregiver that you can trust. So I've got multiple avenues. That's, as a first-time author, it's been kind of a surprise that suddenly I found myself in this position.
Yeah. So basically, like she had dementia, Alzheimer's, whatever was going on with her. She had a caregiver, and the caregiver basically stole most of her money and then faked her own death to get away from it. And you just sort of found all this out piecemeal during the probate period. Is that
correct? Yeah, I found out most of the information after my mother passed away. Discovered really quickly that the caregiver had done this same sort of con on an elder gentleman about 10 years earlier. I had found the obituary from that incident, and then went from there, pulling receipts where I could, getting information, contesting the will. She actually had an annuity my mother had given her, was able to block that as well. And once I blocked that, that's when about 10 days later, the caregiver disappeared. And we were told that she had died. But she had died in a suspicious way at a hospital about an hour north of where she lived, but died of a stroke. And usually you don't think of someone being able to drive an hour for a hospital if they're dying of a stroke. So it was kind of suspicious. But like I said, the other realm is, caregiver. How do you hire a caregiver? What do you need to do to watch and protect yourself? She was able to groom my mother as well as the fiduciaries around her. There was a complete failure in the power of attorney gentleman who was a CPA. We had an attorney that was involved, and a broker that my mother had known for 30 years. And they all seemed to have just succumbed to this woman's whim and was able to get us kicked off the medical power of attorney, so we didn't have any access. Was able to get a second doctor's note that claimed my mother had capacity so that they could get a second will created. And it sounds like some type of crazy Lifetime movie. But it was one of those things that the more I dug into it, I said, oh, this isn't all. There's got to be more to it. And I kept finding more and more. And it kind of went from there.
Wow. It's pretty scary stuff. I mean, especially so many of us have, elderly parents, and you're always kind of hoping that there are checks and balances in place to ensure that they're okay. And then you hear stories like this, and
it's hard. It's you think, oh, the banks are there to protect you, and you realize, no, they're really there to protect themselves and will act as a speed bump in a way.
Some of these details sound so wild. It's like if you wrote a fiction book about them, people wouldn't believe it.
Right. And that was part of the reason I couldn't write a based on true story. It had to be straight nonfiction, because people would go, wait a minute, you made that part up. No, you made that part up. It's like, no, unfortunately, I didn't make any of it up.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes you watch those movies, and then when they say based on a true story, you have to always question how much of it was was pumped up for to make it more exciting for the reader, if it's a movie, for the watcher. Often I find myself, when I watch a movie, usually a movie, where it says based on a true story, I often will start Googling, did that really happen? What part of this is real and what isn't, right? And then you're always like, yeah, all the good stuff, all the crazy stuff isn't real most of the time. But then in your case, a lot of that crazy stuff actually is real.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it was crazy. And so when I started trying to, we'll say, market the book, I didn't have any background, didn't have a PR group. So I started using a couple AI tools to help me write some letters, to start reaching out to get some reviews from different groups. Was able to get something from a researcher, and then from people that do book reviews. And it kind of rolled into, oh, I've got some opportunities to even go into true crime, talking to some podcasters and folks like that. And so as I rolled into it, I realized also, I probably could talk to some attorneys, guys that work in the finance world, that are trying to create protections for their clients. What are they doing? How could they use the book? I had an older lady tell me the book ought to be a manual for, folks that are planning for aging folks, as a guide to watch out. How do you question? What should you do? Which is why I put at the end of the book kind of guidelines on steps to help protect yourself. The book is written as a on the ground, day-to-day type of activity, as opposed to when you get instructions from an attorney, they say, here, create a trust, create when your will, do X, Y, and Z, power of attorneys. But nobody talks about day-to-day activities. How do you hire a caregiver? What should you do to help monitor and things like that? And so my book kind of gets into that. And I hadn't found any other books that really get into that kind of detail, at least in a story way, that makes it interesting to read.
Right. And I can see, so I mean, that's sort of what we wanted to talk about, is that idea where, and this is what I was saying earlier, is like, this is not just, two very related genres that, that people can sort of cross sell. Yeah, right. This is like, I'm trying to sell it as true crime, and I'm trying to sell it as like a guide for helping your elderly parents not get scammed. That's a very different audience group. And that means that all your marketing is either, doubled, or you have to be really, really smart about it.
Yeah.
And so,
what did you do? Yeah. I basically have another spreadsheet that basically is set up in chunks of, is it an academic that I'm looking at? Is it a true crime space? Is it the caregiver space? Had a long conversation yesterday with a group that are caregiver advisors, how to help older people find homes and whatnot. And this story hits a lot of those folks as they try to prepare. But also, I talked to an attorney 2 weeks ago on a show, and it was, how do they protect their clients as they get older with their caregiving options, even going into long-term care folks as opposed to in-home care. Should there be some type of regulatory process like you do for brokers and real estate agents and things? And so those kind of conversations are coming up, which is something I wasn't planning on having. I could see having a conversation about caregiving, but regulatory conversations was something that wasn't on my map, and now it is.
Right. So how did you approach the marketing then? Like, are you basically like just saying, okay, today I'm going to market to this group, and so I'm going to create ads based on that, and then tomorrow I'm going to market to to this one, and then I'm going to create different sort of things for that? Or did you figure out a way that you could have one piece of marketing that will hit multiple different targets?
I was hoping to, but the way the story works out, I really have to kind of pick and choose the chunk of the story that I want to use in the emails, essentially, because most of my marketing has been by email. I've been going through looking for either top podcasters, top researchers, top book reviewers. Do they review in memoirs? Do they review nonfiction? And then crafting the emails such that they focus on those areas that they specialize in. Do you want to hear about, the transactions, which is the ones that I'm talking to with the fraud podcasters, for example? Or do you want to hear about how should you hire a caregiver, things to watch, red flags, which are more interesting to the caregiver world than they are to the fraudster world of banking. So each one has a little bit of a crossover, but it ends up having its own focus.
Right. So are you doing any sort of more traditional marketing around, advertisements, newsletters, or are you basically going for sort of that outreach, of social media outreach?
Yeah, it's been more of a social media outreach by way of email. I've started making some contacts of folks that have other contacts, so I can have some, we'll call warmer connections as opposed to cold calls. I've started doing some ads on Amazon, working through the different genres, starting off with the caregiver side first, and then we'll kind of roll into true crime and some of the other areas just to see what seems to really click. But even the title of the book, I call it a true crime memoir. We've already started, you're crossing lines right there to begin with.
I was going to ask about putting together the book itself. It's like, did you have a structure to it, a plan to it? I mean, you said you sort of wrote it down to have all the details, but did you follow anything like a plot plan to put it into a format that would be satisfying to read?
It started out as a spreadsheet. It was really a spreadsheet by year, because I wanted to jot down what occurred when. And as I started getting into more details, I started then expanding the spreadsheet by year. And then I was like, you know what? There's enough content here to think about a book, because part of what I was looking at was I had a caregiver who had adult daughters that were doing the same thing. So even though she's disappeared, now I want to warn folks about the kids. And then I started going into what you would call kind of a structured book creating, where I started writing down characters and things like that, getting in some more details, because then I did have someone help me out with writing it, because I didn't want to write a book where it just sounded like this happened, then this happened. I wanted it to be more of a story.
Right.
That's always the challenge, isn't it? When you're writing something that really happened, but you want it to be satisfying to read for the reader. And I guess true crime is a very well-established genre. So were there any sort of inspirations that you had when you were putting it together? Had you read much true crime before that?
I've read a little true crime. I'm from Texas, and there's an author down in Texas that's known nationally. That I read one of his books. In fact, even prodded him a little bit to see if he would write my story to begin with. But I also was looking at some crime investigating, thinking of it as more of a private investigator. What would you do? How would you approach it? I looked at, because I wanted the story to also be kind of a quick moving, fast read, something that didn't just sit there for a little while. You should enjoy it, go through it, even though it's a heavy topic. One of the books I looked at was Sue Grafton's alphabet murder series, for example. And one of her books, I believe it was T, covers adult elder abuse, and wanted to write it and kind of used that structure where it was more of an interesting, here's the character, here's the things they did, and how did they come about finding out, different pieces of information, and how did they investigate, and what all, because I was telling people, at the time, because of COVID, you could go, everybody had a chat bot that you could go ask questions on. So I was doing my research, whether it was calling, Office Depot or Sam's or whoever, and I would put in that I was my mother. So I was posing as my 80-year-old mother at times, so they would, converse with me. If we hadn't had the pandemic, some of the things I was able to pull, I don't think I would have gotten as much information. So it was.
That's kind of an interesting thought, isn't it?
Yeah, I was like, I can pretend to be my mother if I want to, just to get the information, and we did. I walked into Sam's and was able to get information on the lady's account, the caregiver's account, just by giving them her phone number. Unfortunately, I couldn't get much more information, but it gave me some clues to put together some other things I was trying to get to. So that was part of the reason also, was to look at it as, what were the things I did to basically investigate what had gone on? Because otherwise, just writing about financial elder abuse is kind of dry. So I decided to write more of an investigation around that topic, and that's kind of where we got to.
I mean, it sounds like you have some good instincts as a writer in terms of writing something that is going to spark the interest of readers and have more of a market. Do you see yourself writing anything else in the future?
Well, it's kind of funny. Once we went through this process, I've got a couple of grandkids under the age of 4, and we've toyed with writing a children's series with books that you would sit down with the grandkids on their way to bed, around animals or pets in the house. And basically, we had a chinchilla for 18 years. And so we've thought about using the chinchilla as the star of the show. There aren't any chinchilla stories out there. And basically how they interacted with the animals in the house. But each time he leaves the cage to be set free by the humans, it's an adventure. So when he's hopping through the den and going around the couch, he's really maybe in the Amazon or somewhere else. Or if he gets into a box, because he had adventures for real where he fell into a box and was trapped. He could run free in the house and he trapped himself. And so we're like, well, maybe that box is really a cavern or a cave. So we're playing with some of the ideas of doing that. At one point, he was being stalked by one of our cats, and he hopped up on the cat and rode the cat essentially for about 2 seconds. But in our book, you could be on a cat in the wild, wild west in the 1850s, somewhere in Wyoming, maybe, or something. So we're thinking of doing it something in that realm. So it gives you some opportunities to make a series. And then something completely opposite, looking at a potential serial killer that is looking to solve a problem that has her family just distraught because somebody had murdered a child. And a relative has a way to maybe fix that, and there becomes a moral dilemma. And so looking at it, having a serial killer option with a potential moral dilemma is something that I'm looking at as well. So it's all of them are completely different. And so it just kind of, we'll go from, for elder abuse to happy kid book to potential serial killer.
I will say the kid book I really like the sound of. When I was a kid, my parents had one called Monsieur Bussy, which is about a hamster with a French accent who got loose, and he did exactly that. When he was going through the legs of the chair, he thought it was a forest, and when he was going up the stairs, he thought it was a mountain. So I think you should write that book. I think that sounds fantastic.
Oh, and it's funny because of, as I was going through the probate process, it would just drive my wife crazy. She just was furious and never wanted to talk about it. So while writing the book, she didn't want to be involved because it just made her mad. But the kid book, she has totally 100% wants to get into it. So once I get through some of the main marketing here, we'll circle back and start putting that together, because the goal is to make it kind of a, you know, a graphic. You know, you've seen the Peppa Pig books and stories, and what's the other one with the dogs out of Australia? That are really popular. And so that's kind of what made me think about it. And then I was like, well, you know, if we put these together with the chinchilla, and there aren't, you could then start having plushies, and now we're starting to think of, you know, merchandise. So we'll see what happens, but I'm hoping to write the story as well. Yeah.
I find it so funny that something that is such a difficult tragedy that you had to deal with opened up a whole new world of possibilities for you.
Yeah, no, if you went back and told me 5 years ago, you're going to write a book and maybe a couple of books, and people will actually be interested, I would have just laughed and said you're on drugs, because it wasn't something I would have thought of. You know, you look back on what I did school-wise, barely getting out of school, I didn't write stories, but I actually am pretty decent at telling stories. So if we can turn it into words, maybe it'll be interesting.
Being like, how dare you? I don't need to write books to take drugs.
I think you'll find that the marketing of your children's book is a lot easier than the marketing of this current book,
and more fun.
And yeah, absolutely more fun. So how's the reception of this one gone? And are you finding that, you know, one group over another is taking it up more?
It's been interesting. The caregiver folks, when I get their attention, they look into the book, they really like it and have responded really well and think it can be of value. I've got one person who does a lot of caregiving podcasts that is going to cover the topic and use my book as a resource and keep it on her website. I've talked to a researcher that studies long-term care facilities, term care facilities that, you know, there's been abuse and whatnot. And when I told him my story, he'd never had enough data to really research home care and was really interested. And I've had that response from a couple researchers. So it's been good once I get a hold of, you know, get their attention. I'm coming across a lot of folks, kind of which is what I expected, where you've got a lot of folks that are, you know, the baby boomers that are now in their 60s and up, and folks that are, you know, distant from their parents. How are they going to take care of them? And so it gets their attention.
And when you are trying all these different sort of modes of basically of social media marketing, what is working better than, you know, everything else? Like, you know, a lot of authors typically tend to use more traditional marketing, you know, newsletters, advertisements on Facebook or Amazon, social media stuff. You know, they'll post it on their page, maybe some other people will cross post, but you know, we don't hear a lot about authors doing sort of that individual outreach, because it's hard, right? You've got to spend a lot more time. Mm-hmm. You know, an ad you set up and let it run, right? And it works, it doesn't work. Maybe you spend some time tweaking it and watching it, but like it sounds like you're doing a lot more work for the marketing. You've got to contact all these people. You got to go onto the podcast and talk to them, and then hope that they have an audience that wants to buy the book. Trying to reach people individually to sell to them is going to be a lot harder, obviously, right? So what's working better for you? I
don't know that necessarily one's working better than the other. I had somebody who interviewed me a few weeks ago and posted it on LinkedIn, and she's got a pretty decent following. The researcher I spoke about a minute ago, he's had a decent following and he reposted it. But I don't know that anything's really jumped out. I went through a tool called Freebie. I think it is Freezebee's website, where they offer you can offer free downloads, and was able to get almost 1,300 downloads within 48 hours through that group, which I'm expecting now a few reviews to show up on Amazon from that. But that told me there was at least some interest in seeing more of it. I'm hoping eventually to probably go walk into a traditional publisher, maybe in about 30 days, and see about doing more of a distribution through that realm. Been talking to local folks, but it has been one-on-one. But like I said, I've been able to do some stuff online to get what I would call good lists, which is what most salespeople end up having to do, is find a good list of high priority reviewers, high priority podcast folks, and then just contact them. I haven't gone to the big guys, I'm not showing up on a 2020 or Dateline show yet, but who knows in 30 days.
Right. I almost like wonder if it would have been easier from a marketing perspective, maybe not from the upfront work perspective, of sort of almost doing this as two separate books. One is a very straight true crime story, and the other as a elder scan, like where it's like more of a how to take care of your care, make sure that the caregiver process is working, all that extra stuff, where people will get it and be like, okay, here's all the things I gotta watch for, just almost like a how-to book, and that way well, first of all, you've doubled your the number of books you have in your catalog, but that way you could do that traditional sort of true crime marketing with the one, and sort of market the other one, and that way you're not as split. But then of course you have to write two books.
Right. Yeah. And I had like I said initially, I didn't know where I was going, because right. I'd never written before, and once I got into it and realized the style I wanted. And it was kind of funny, the lady I got to help me out, her background was actually in criminology. So we were able to kind of keep that realm, or taste of the book kind of within it, as opposed to this is what a caregiver was doing. So it sounded like an investigation or true crime.
Yeah. I just I think it's so difficult, right, to sell to two different things, because your product page, and so what have you done with that? Because your product page is a static thing, right? And if you either got to write it for one audience or the other, and trying to sort of straddle the line for that to make it appeal to two different audiences runs the risk of sort of making it not appealing to either of them, right? So that's another reason why I would have been inclined to sell it as two different books. But so how did you approach that?
What I've done is my kind of using my Amazon page as my test ground or sandbox. Recently, I've kind of moved more to we'll call it kind of an ominous sound at the beginning of the description, essentially saying, do you know who's watching your parents, and walking through that style of description of the book, where it's like, are you watching out? This is what happened in my case, and these are the things that you need to watch out for. And it's also why, like I said, at the end of it, I give suggestions on how to help protect yourself individually, story tips that you don't usually see. The last chapter, I don't know if you guys have gone through the book yet, is kind of a creative chapter on my part, because I start to explore the idea of the caregiver really faked her death. Is she really alive? And I start bringing in a little bit of highlighting the investigation that I did. I got 6,000 emails out of her email account, and was able to find her prior activity with the older man, her buying of a small house before my mother passed outside of town, and some other activity that we'll call them suspicious, and kind of put the case together that, hey, there's a chance she's still alive. She could be dead, but when you call the crematory that she was supposedly processed at and ask her if they weigh her, and they said, yeah. And I said, could you tell me how much she weighed? And they tell me, oh, about 200 pounds. And I say, oh, that's interesting, because she was about 70 pounds lighter than that usually. kind of makes you go, and so that was part of the interest in putting the book together.
Now, were you the one leading this investigation? I mean, were you the one who was like, this doesn't add up and started looking into it? Or did other people, I mean, basically, would she have got away with it if you hadn't have investigated?
Oh, yeah. When we got initially, when my mother first died and we got the note that the caregiver was going to get an annuity and was part of this new will that we were totally unaware of that ever existed. My sister and I looked at each other and go, well, I've got to contest the will because this is nuts. And so I started off looking into it and then realized if I was going to investigate this and have the attorney's office investigate it, I'm paying his office $250 to $500 an hour to do the investigation. I can do it for free and it's just my time. So, and I figured I would be more curious than his office. So I just kind of started noodling around, and the more I noodled around, the more I found, and just kind of went from there. So yeah, no, it was, as I went along, would go back to my attorney and said, no, you don't understand. There's more to this. And he's seen all kinds of stories. And he just like, okay, maybe, but there's not much more. I said, no, there's more. And then I would bring something else to him a couple weeks later. And they thought I was nuts because I gave him a PowerPoint at one point, list showing all the activity. And so, yeah, no, it was me pushing it. And it was funny. My sister and I flipped roles because early on, back in 2019, my sister pushed for us to get a letter from the doctor's office that she was of capacity or not. And when that letter came back that said she wasn't, we got kicked off the medical power of attorney within 10 days from there. But when we got to the information about the annuity and the new will, and I started showing my sister this, the roles flipped. Suddenly I thought something was, really up, and my sister like, no, she really couldn't have done all that. And I just kept building and just kept going.
It's that faith in human spirit will always end up disappointing you, won't it?
Yep. Did anything come of it? Like in terms of, did anyone in an official capacity sort of take the case up after you presented all this and say, they're going to go after her, and then that's when she disappeared? And then at that point, is anybody like trying to track down whether or not she really did, or they just dumped it all and said, too bad, it's over,
Yeah, well, the biggest challenge I had was I was essentially a third party. We had the executor for my mother's will who represented my mother, and he didn't think anything was wrong. And so we couldn't file anything. We couldn't bring charges. But I know the caregiver thought something was up because she started acting different and would never take a phone call from us, even early on. But yeah, it was frustrating. So all I can do is, investigate from afar and see what I can find. But it at least led me to a point where when we were able to settle with her estate, she got maybe half of what she thought was coming. So that was, and in one aspect, that was good.
But then, and she faked her own death though. So were there any repercussions for that?
Well, that's the potential part. I can't prove she faked her own death. I can only give you enough circumstantial evidence that says, hey, you might want to sniff around. The county that it occurred in apparently is known for not really having a lot of good, we'll call it, compliance following when it comes to the coroner's office and whatnot. They outsource that activity. So if you were to pull something in that region, that is apparently the county to do it. But yeah, like I said, there's enough circumstantial evidence, and I covered in the book, that if I could get somebody's attention, maybe to get her medical records from the 2 visits to that hospital, would be a place to start. But you got some laws around to deal with.
Yeah, you feel like at the end of this, even if they weren't willing to put the effort in at the beginning themselves, once you sort of give them all the evidence, they would be like, in an ideal world, they would look at it and be like, oh yeah, we should investigate this.
We could do something. Yeah. I mean, the faking of the death, but I know she didn't have insurance. So I know there wasn't, an insurance policy that was, falsely paid on.
Yeah, I guess faking your own death is probably itself not a crime unless you're getting some kind of...
Theoretically, I think it still is, because it avoided being able to be prosecuted for basically elder abuse of my mother.
But would she? But that was what I was saying. Is like, was anyone even going to do that to her?
There was a chance of it because of the circumstance, the evidence I was putting together as far as what she was doing purchasing wise, what she'd been spending, and the financial or forensic of what I did as far as the spending. We were building up, there was the potential for it. But once she disappeared and you're dealing with her estate, and those folks theoretically are third parties also. So,
but there must have been a death certificate, right? So
yes.
Did you talk to the coroner specifically and say, and what did they say?
Yeah. So the death certificate was signed at the hospital by a doctor. The coroner, they don't do any autopsies unless the person either came to the hospital and died within 24 hours or the family suggested it. So they were kind of out of the loop. So that got me into, FOIAing the 911 folks to see if she came by ambulance, and never found any information there. And could she have been in the area? Sure, it's possible. She could have been in the area and just had bad luck. The fact that it was 100 days or so after my mother passed away, and my mother had a provision in the will that you had to live beyond 90 days past her death to be able to receive any of the beneficiaries, as well as when I saw some emails, once I got her email account, of her sending off the my mother's will and death certificate to her daughter's email account there on the same day that she found out she wasn't going to get the annuity either, because the annuity was outside of probate. So that she thought for sure she was getting. And when I blocked that, she probably thought the walls were coming and she was out of there. She was in her early 70s, looked younger, but obviously was spry enough, had enough money. She had conned them into paying her $30 an hour. So she grossed up close to $300,000 a year for 3 years. So the means were there to, if you wanted to pull something, she could have pulled something.
Right. And you said she had done this before?
She had conned an old man 10 years earlier and gotten into his account, gotten into his house, and was able to actually marry him after 2 years. He died 4 months later. She got the house and his broker account, which ended up combined about $500,000 there for that one.
Wow, it's just amazing that people get away with this stuff.
Oh yeah, and most of the biggest challenge is a lot of people just don't report it. The bigger ones are the ones where the person is alone, basically. The family members aren't in town, they aren't nearby, there's no one to really check on regularly. And I've heard this in a couple places. And they just start with little things, and if no one's paying attention, it just kind of builds. And if no one's paying attention, it snowballs. In our case, in the middle of it, you had the pandemic. And so she ended up being locked in a condo building, essentially. And I didn't see her for 2 years. And so that left her alone as well. But yeah, if you're not there, the same thing with the older man. His family was out of state, and there wasn't anybody there to check on him regularly.
No. Well, that is pretty crazy. Okay, so now what's next with you? Do you have more ideas about taking this book and bringing it to different sources, or are you pretty much tapped out on your ideas about how you want to market it?
Well, it's one of those things. Yeah, I could push doing things, getting people to email, getting people to my website, build newsletters, things like that. And I'm trying right now to kind of avoid some of that, where I'm just doing things like this, where we're doing podcasts, where I'm getting folks to review the book. Like I said, I may go probably approach a publisher or agent in the next 30 to 45 days because I think the story has opportunity to be done in other media sources. You know, could this show up on a Lifetime or a Netflix? Maybe. So there's some opportunity there, I think, and I've come across some agents that work with first-time authors and that have access to those types of resources. So I'll keep doing the podcasts. I've got a true crime podcast tomorrow. I've got caregiver podcasts. I've got financial scam artist podcasts over the next few weeks. So I'll start having a lot of things kind of hit the airways probably in May. And June is interesting because June is Elder Abuse Month. So it kind of, the timing is actually kind of good as far as the opportunities. So we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah. Wow.
And I was going to say, it's almost a story that hasn't quite finished yet as well, isn't it?
If you want to look at it, I talked to an attorney the other day that said, maybe we can get a private investigator to go check out that little house that's, out in the boonies somewhere to see it, because I know that they put stuff in that house because she used a U-Haul to empty my mother's storage unit, and they left the U-Haul at the U-Haul drop-off place. That's about 15 minutes from that tucked away home. So I know there's stuff there. What's there, I don't know, but I know there is. And so if you could come up with a reason to go knock on the door, I'd love to. The attorney suggested sticking one of those cameras out there on the post on the street, like you would if you were tracking animals in the woods, and just see what kind of traffic goes in and out of the house.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, did you consider like a private investigator to watch even the daughter, right, to see if she has contact with her? But I know that you had mentioned before, there's a price you'd have to pay for all that, and then at the end of the day, what are you really going to do with that information other than peace of mind, maybe? But
it's one of those things, and that's part of the reason. I went into this more is I didn't want to walk away still having a lot of questions. What really happened to this and that. So the caregiver's death certificate, for example, the caregiver had 4 daughters in town, but there's no relatives on the death certificate. It's her boyfriend and the guy who ended up being her executor. And I've always thought that was kind of odd. Maybe it wasn't, but it was one of those things. It's like, maybe the daughters don't know that there's something going on, because that house that was out in the boonies that she went to purchase and died before completing the sale, the executor for her estate went back and formally bought that house back at the beginning of 24. So they have it. And when I tried to send a private investigator there back in 23, it was overgrown. No one else was obviously living there. But now, my Google Map pictures show me it looks like it's been cleaned up a little bit. And, if someone wanted to go knock on the door or, stick a camera out there, it might be interesting.
What I was just thinking as you were saying that, one of the interesting things is we have guests like you on the podcast to talk about book marketing and stuff. But there are some books that are so fascinating that we end up talking more about the concept of the book than the marketing. And it's funny because the most important thing about marketing a book is to have a book with a real hook to it.
Right.
So that's kind of an interesting. Have you found, what is the podcast that you've been on? What is the feedback been from that? Have people been looking at you more as the author part, or have other people become like focused on the story?
They've gotten more into the story, and the more that I drop different pieces, within the story. For example, in 2019, suddenly my mother wasn't living in her condo that she'd lived in there for 20 plus years because there had been a flood in the bathroom. When I contacted the building 6 months later, asked for the maintenance report, found out they had found something in the pipe in the toilet that wasn't supposed to be there. And I was like, oh, what was that? And eventually he told me, it was an adult diaper had been stuffed, looked like it had been stuffed in the pipe. Caused the flood. So my mother moved out of the apartment and into a new condo 10 miles away. So now she was isolated. And so it looked purposeful.
That's
Wow.
creepy. It's yes, it's so distressing because this is of course your parent who you love, who raised you, and
Yeah, it was a challenge because the one of the things about thinking that was suspicious was the executor for the caregiver's estate. His day job, he was a plumber, and so it's like, how did you figure that one out? Oh,
There's a lot, there's a lot of stuff going on there.
isn't it?
Right?
Yeah, I know. And so this is kind of the podcast of, we've talked about caregiving when I'm on the caregiving ones, but we end up rolling into some of this craziness of the story. And, how can you help prevent folks? Because one of the biggest challenges is whether she had medical issues or people watching her finance, there's very few tools that can help you combine all that information in one place. Everything's essentially siloed unless someone's really looking to, aggregate it across, the different specialties.
It's crazy. Now, unfortunately, we're coming up to the top of the hour, so we're going to have to wrap things up. But this has been such a fascinating discussion. I was going to say, where can people find out more about your book, more about everything to do with this journey that you've been on?
Sure. So obviously, I'm selling it. It's on Amazon, so you've got that. But I do have the website. It's called thecaregiversgame.com, and it's got some information there as well as different information for caregivers and watching out for yourself, and other podcasts that I'm being on or will be on. Like I said, I've recorded a number of them. A lot of them that will start dropping at the end of this month or into May. So those are the two places.
Well, that's fantastic. We will make sure to pop a link to that website down in the description down below. So if you've been listening on Spotify or watching on YouTube and you have found everything that Chip has had to say fascinating, which I'm sure you have because we have, make sure you scroll down there, click on that link and go and check out his website. And while you're there, you will also pass that big empty comment box. So make sure you leave Chip a comment, let him know how much you have enjoyed everything that he shared with us today and your own thoughts about this, because it's I think it's a topic that all of us eventually will have to look into. So make sure you leave a comment. Also, there's that like button. If you skip that, smash that bell icon to get notified every time there's a new episode of Fully Booked. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. So Chip, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciated everything you had to say.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
And everyone else, until next week, cheerio.